the premise of my talk, and really the factual basis of my talk, is that we weren't even talking about honor crime until violence against women became known and established as an international human rights violation. So what I really want to talk about is how this all came about, and we landed at this place of identifying crimes of honor as discrimination against women as one of the most egregious instances of violence against women. And I think we're left with the question, which it seems to be hovering here, is how useful is it to be calling it crimes of honor or honor killing, as opposed to this is one more really terrible example of violence against women, which our systems must deal with. And I think that question that's the ultimate question that we're going to be ending up with tomorrow. The whole context of human rights, I want to talk about the mechanics of how the human rights systems works, and how I covered a little bit of this yesterday when I talked about the commentary at a seminar at the law school. So a few people here may have heard some of this already. If the fundamental and elemental and primary and forever key to working effectively in human rights is to understand that it's a political system rather than a legal system in the classic sense. And the reason is primarily that while the international human rights treaties are legal instruments, and they have a lot of things hanging from them that look like legal instruments and legal premises, the entire compliance and implementation process is political. And we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about human rights in general and women's human rights specifically, that we don't really get anywhere with it unless we understand the entire context in which it works. So, in some legal systems, human rights treaties can actually be cited. They become law upon adoption by a state. In other systems, and they can be cited and used in cases. And in other systems, in the common law systems, generally, they do not become law upon adoption. They are a principle of interpretation of constitutions and laws, but they don't have the force of law in most common law systems. And even in some civil code systems where they supposedly, generally speaking, would have the force of law, there are some systems still where legislation has to be adopted to really implement them. So generalizations about this are very difficult to make because we have so many legal systems in the world. But we back into, again, this question of what is an international legal instrument and what does it mean when it has the force of law in some places, it doesn't have the force of law in others. So again, pull back and think of it as we are in a vastly political system. And of course, they're a political product to begin with because they're negotiated. The language is always negotiated, which is why the language is never entirely satisfactory. And the entire work of the human rights system for the last 60 years, basically, has been to articulate in more detail what those vague negotiated terms mean. And of course, that has evolved over the years, too. So it's a never-ending process. A number of the human rights treaties all of the human rights treaties have a monitoring process that, again, is largely political. The treaties themselves establish a review process, a monitoring process. They say there'll be a review committee. They'll say how many people should be on it and how they're elected, and even how some of them say how often the committee should meet, and some of them don't. But the procedures are prescribed within the treaty itself. And again, though, there's nothing within the treaties that really prescribes how to enforce compliance. What the treaties really say is there shall be a review system. And so, and it's voluntary. I mean, there's really no way to pull a government in that has not reported for the 20 years since it ratified a treaty, except by constant embarrassment, and clearly they're not terribly embarrassed or they'd be there. And then governments change and all of a sudden they're there. And we saw, by the way, upon the breakup of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden there were many more states parties to every treaty. The first thing they did was ratify all the human rights treaties without a clue as to what that really meant. But But the reason that states ratify treaties, and particularly human rights treaties, is that it's something to do to make them respectable as a nation. Whether they understand what it means or not, and how, no matter how developed their I mean, we're talking about new so-called democracies, some of which never really became democracies, brand new nations, the first thing they do is ratify treaties because now we're a country. And then afterwards, if there's a well-developed civil society, or frequently civil society has to develop along with the governments in general, they work out together what that means. Because frequently they really don't, and I mean, I had the privilege of being in Moldova in 2000, and it was clear they still were trying to get a grasp of what it meant to have ratified all these treaties. So many of them have ratified, and they're behind on reporting because they're really not sure what to do. And the UN has done some work on helping new states understand treaty obligations, understand the reporting, but there's never enough resources within the UN system to do that for everybody who needs it. So it's imperfect in terms of who shows up to be reviewed and what they do with the reviews afterwards. And then a number of the treaties, and more of them, have a system of also bringing individual complaints on a naming a person or party that has been whose rights have been violated, and bringing a case that gets reviewed as an individual complaint. The Human Rights Committee, which is a civil and political rights treaty, has had an optional protocol for many, many years, and has, I don't even know the number, I should, but I don't, hundreds, perhaps thousands of cases that they have adjudicated. Recently, somebody did a study of what the results were of that, and again, when cases are adjudicated under these protocols that provide for individual cases, the committee issues an opinion and says to the government, go forth and fix it, and then there isn't really any sanction for not fixing it. And if we have time and discussion, there's a famous story about that particular issue and the implementation questions and what it takes to get implementation. There's recently a study done by Open Society Institute, sponsored by Open Society Institute, of the implementation of the Human Rights Committee's cases, and they showed that about a third of the decisions had been in some way followed up by the governments. Now, that doesn't sound like very much. No, people are saying no. On the other hand, it's, one-third. I mean, it's more than would not. I mean, somebody followed up. And also, I come from a baseball culture, and I can tell you that .333 batting average is not bad. So no one else here is from. A few people here are from a baseball culture, but it's a perspective issue. It's better. It's sort of better than nothing. I don't really defend it. I'm not crazy about the whole process. Although somebody yesterday pointed out that it does provide these decisions provide more clarity about specific provisions. So again, it's a question of civil society working very hard to follow up, and the gift of a decision under an individual complaint is that you have a much more clear statement about government obligations under a particular provision. But the role of civil society in following up just cannot be overestimated. That's really the key to the whole thing. And some people would say, in fact, that civil society was critically important to even inventing a functioning human rights system. NGOs had a considerable role in the negotiation of the UN Charter, and NGOs have had a major role in framing human rights issues, first with the UN Commission on Human Rights, and then ultimately with all the treaty bodies, and now with the Human Rights Council. Amnesty International really was instrumental. And they were the first to really make a splash. There are a few others that are even older than Amnesty International, but the NGOs are the ones that articulated the issues and forced attention to them. I mean, the UN is a club of governments. They're not gonna say, "Oh God, we did bad." There has to be somebody to point out the issues, and it is civil society and a handful of really good people within the system who will listen and work with it. So The human rights treaties are also unusual in another respect. They're in the nature of a contract almost between a government and the people who live under I won't say citizens, people under the jurisdiction of the government, because non-citizens also enjoy rights under the treaties. The the obligations formally run between government to government. That's what a treaty regime is. But in human rights treaties are really about government's obligations to provide for rights where they live. And so this is also why civil society is so critical, because that's who identifies the issues and can use the treaties to call their governments to account, both on a local and less formal advocacy level and on an international level within the review system. And in the last 20 years or so, we have seen an enormous growth in the understanding in the NGO community about how to use the treaty processes for advocacy, working back and forth between the international level and the local level. And my own program has developed the access to CEDAW in particular, and also worked with other treaty bodies to demystify the process for the NGOs and help make the connection between the NGOs and the individual experts on the treaty monitoring bodies who are willing to listen. And it's also important to understand, with respect to the human rights treaties, that the monitoring bodies are made up of people who are not ambassadors. They are individuals who are nominated by their governments, so they have to have some connections, obviously. But they don't call the Capitol for instructions on how to behave and what to say in every meeting, and many of them push the limits on positions. Some of them, unfortunately, when you have somebody who's the deputy foreign minister of Egypt, you're going to have a problem, right? And there is a problem with very high level people high level political people being nominated. But most of the experts are not high level political people. They are people who have enough time to do this unpaid, but they are frequently people with considerable expertise in a particular area, and frequently with considerable passion, or they wouldn't be devoting so much time to it. And they want to be accessible, and they want to move the agenda. So it's a very unusual space within the human rights, within the UN. The human rights system is a very unusual space, because it is just about the only place where, I will say, ordinary people, assuming you know how to get a pass and it's not that difficult, can walk into a meeting that is closed to everyone else, and sit there and then have lunch with the members. It works. That works. It is, however, imperfect, because the review system is also a committee system, and we all know what happens with committees. And the review system ends up, every state that shows up and does a report gets on a schedule for review, and the committee looks at the review, at the report. It looks at what NGOs have given it. And by the way, now the UN Center, what used to be the UN Center for Human Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, has a website in which all the documentation for every session is now posted. And for CEDAW, which just moved to Geneva in 2008, the NGO reports were not posted by its former service body, but now the NGO reports are also posted for CEDAW. So all the documentation is online, and actually not that hard to find, it took a while for the UN to figure that out, but it's not that hard to find. So if you are interested in pursuing a particular issue, it's right there. It's there to find. It's not like somebody will feed it to you, but it is right there. So the system is, because it's just an unusual approach, because countries don't like to give up sovereignty by ratifying treaties unless there's something in it for them. And when you're looking at human rights, it's a real invasion of sovereignty. What's in it for them? It's not like it's going to help their trade situation. It's just going to open them to more criticism. And yet, the CEDAW Treaty now has 187 ratifications out of 192 states members of the UN. We can talk at length at another time about why the U.S. has not ratified and how I've managed to have a career of dealing with CEDAW from the country that hasn't ratified. That's another conversation. And it's not going to get any better in the next 4 years, I can tell you that. Obama tried, but not, we're stuck. So the whole point of this explanation is really to say this is all a political process. And people are daunted by the supposedly legal language, which, by the way, if you are a lawyer, which I unfortunately still am, it's not very precise as legal language goes. And one of my colleagues refers to the language of the UN, including treaties, as globish. And I will say, in fact, it's one of my Australian colleagues who's one of the more witty people I know. Why do Australians always sound witty to Americans? But every Australian I know is witty, actually. And the Australians, in fact, had a great deal to do. I mentioned this yesterday. The Australians had a great deal to do, in fact, with the development of CEDAW in particular and violence against women in particular. And some of you probably know these people. I mean, Hilary Charlesworth is here, right? And Andrew Burns, who was here for a while and is now in Sydney. And Jane Connors, who came from Australia, ended up teaching at SOAS and is now in the UN. And then somebody reminded me yesterday, Elizabeth Evatt, who was not only on the CEDAW committee and chaired the CEDAW committee, but is one of the most dynamic people who could be in this business, and then went on to be in the Human Rights Committee, where she forced gender on them. So, together with another woman who was really powerful. So, there's a great Australian record on women's human rights. I have to tell you this. So what I want to talk about, first of all, the one other issue about why we do all this and why we spend all this time on this. As I said, my job really over the last 25 years has been demystifying the human rights system. I don't consider myself a scholar in the classic sense. I've really spent most of my time working in advocacy, but from within a university. So I kind of sit on both sides of it. And if you're in a university, particularly now I'm with the law faculty, people have a lot of grand ideas about human rights, and they write about human rights, and the students will say, well, yeah, so show us how it works. And when you work with the NGOs, they get very frustrated with people who theorize. And ultimately, though, she's laughing. But ultimately, it all comes together, which is why I did this chart, to show you that none of it could have happened unless we had civil society scholars and UN experts working together on these projects, on this project of particularly establishing women's human rights as human rights, and establishing violence against women as a human rights issue, which is really what this chart documents, and I'll run through it very quickly in a couple minutes. I've said frequently, and I'll say again, and I'll keep saying probably till after I retire, that this is not a business for the impatient. If you sort of say, oh yeah, here's this piece of paper, so what? If you look at what the world was like for women 30 years ago, and you look at it now in just about every country, even if laws haven't changed, even if we have all these issues about culture, the fact is we have a conversation going now that we did not have 30 years ago. And you can't make change unless you can name the problem. And the first gift that the human rights system has given to women, and I mean to lots of, to everybody, but for women, is a space in which the problem is named, and a space in which governments have to agree to the naming. They are in the room. So even if you can't, one of the things we've seen over and over again, and we even experienced it in the US during the Bush administration, is that when you feel that your central government is not listening to NGOs, you can go to the UN and say, guess what, someone else tell them what's going on here. And that was literally the experience of the human rights organizations during the Bush administration. I mean, you couldn't get anybody to answer a phone call, but there were 3 reviews, and there were 160 U.S. NGOs when the Human Rights Committee reviewed the U.S. in 2006. I mean, they moved the meeting because, and there was standing room only. And yeah, it was sort of pro forma, but somebody was listening, and that was enormously empowering when everything feels pretty dreary at home. And gradually, when it comes to dealing with the status of women and the rights of women, who for half the world, women are the other, right? And discrimination against women is something that is very difficult to avoid because men and women live together, everywhere. And the issues there's a similarity in certain issues across the board, which generally have to do with the power relationships. And on a global scale, we've been able to name this in a way that just was not named before, which leads me to the violence discussion. I did this chart. I started to write it all out, and I thought I don't do PowerPoint. I don't know how to do PowerPoint. I thought if you have this, you'll take it home or you'll scribble on it or do whatever. So, and we got it on 2 pages. This is good. I worked on that actually. Now, if you start with the first big column says 1975 to 1989 because the conversation specifically about violence, very pointed, this conversation didn't really start till about 1989, 1990. We had a number of really interesting things happening from the time of the First World Conference on Women in 1975 through 1989. There were 3 World Conferences on Women, which is listed here under intergovernmental and UN. We had and then we had the establishment of, I didn't even count them, but I started all these groups that are listed. These are all NGOs that were new. From 1975 through 1989 was the big movement to establish women's internationally focused NGOs. And my first list was, I did it all in acronyms, and I thought, well, that's not going to help anybody, is it? Right? So that's why this column is so big, because I went back and I wrote all the names out. And if you look at the years, these are relatively young organizations, and the impetus for doing this, for starting these organizations, was in fact the Decade for Women, which was largely about women development, not about women's human rights. But the 1975 International Women's Year and the first International Conference on Women began to name the issues, more in a development context than in a rights context, but began to name the issues officially in a UN document that all the governments signed on to. So it was the first big, global, clear conversation. And there were 2 more international conferences during that decade. The last one was in 1985. And by 1985 in Nairobi, the language about violence was much clearer than it had been 10 years earlier. And the language about rights was much clearer than it had been 10 years earlier. But like all World Conference documents, it had absolutely no implementation or accountability mechanisms. Governments sign on to it and they all go home. And there's nothing set up to monitor it afterwards except something called the Commission on the Status of Women, which I'll give you an earful about at some other time. Because the Commission drafted the treaties and it organized the conferences, but as a policy body, I find it wanting. Let's just put it that way. Because there's no accountability with the Commission on the Status of Women either. Treaties set up an accountability mechanism, and that is the key to moving an agenda. You can lobby yourself to death at a UN commission, and you get a nice little statement, and then you have no idea what's going to happen with it. You don't have anything that you can go home and wave and say, the UN has said, my government, do this. That really only happens with the human rights treaties. So that's why I've devoted most of my energy and career to the human rights treaties. So, but I will say that, to the credit of the UN, because that's really what it was, the larger and the more formalized recognition of women's status issues as rights issues did begin in these conferences that were put together by the Commission on the Status of Women. And then you see at the same, so all of these organizations that started up were, a lot of them started around the time of the 1985 Nairobi conference. That was when the energy really collected and the money started to flow. And this is the column I didn't put on here. But don't ever forget that volunteers can only do so much, and nobody can nobody's going to. Someone has to pay the plane fare, if nothing else, right? You have to get places, and someone has to buy a computer, and you know what? You really need paid staff so that they'll show up every day and get it done. And there's only so much you can do with volunteers, although God knows a lot of this is built on volunteer as well. So the availability of funds from the late 80s through the 90s made a huge difference. I mean, there were a number of American foundations and European donors that signed on to fund this work. After the end of the 90s, when they thought the job was done and said they were moving on to other things, and so that again is another story. But the 90s was an enormous amount of activity in making things happen. And so what you see, and at the same time that the organizations were getting organized and these UN conferences were happening, we were seeing a handful of scholars who were writing things about women's human rights and therefore legitimizing women's human rights as human rights in the larger context, which had also been legitimized by scholars. And there aren't very many of them. And when we went to put together the commentary, the CEDAW commentary, there still weren't that many of them. And every once in a while, I sort of gather up who's writing now, and I have to say, everybody, all the people here who are under 50, keep writing. Just keep writing. Start writing and keep writing, because we need a whole new generation. And I mean, I have to say, I'm well over 50. We need a new generation, and we're seeing it, and we're pushing people along, but we need more people to be writing both scholarly things, especially, to keep that legitimization going. And there's lots of human rights scholarship, but not enough yet on women's human rights, I will tell you that. So by 1991, we had seen a couple of major articles on women's human rights. Charlotte Bunch, I don't know how many of you know who she is, started the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers and made a big splash with an article about violence against women as a human rights issue. And I didn't give you the full title, but the title is basically revisioning. That's the key word. And then along came in 1991 this sort of landmark article that came out of here about feminist perspectives on international law, and it was published in the American Journal of the Journal of the American Society for International Law. It took the prize for the best article that year, which stunned everyone because it challenged everything. But it challenged it with fabulous footnotes. So so we were on a roll. You know, that really launched a very legitimate discussion. And then if you flip over to, I hope some of this is self-explanatory, and I don't want to spend much more time on this, but if you flip over to the next side, starting in 1993, you start seeing the conferences of the 90s where the rest of this issue, where the rest of the issues, especially around violence, became more and more and more pointed. Because at the World Conference on Human Rights, there was a whole section on women's human rights that was the product of this new sophistication of how to work a conference and how to make governments listen and how to lobby governments. And at the risk of sounding extremely arrogant as an American, it was Bella Abzug who taught us all. And by all, I mean everybody around the world. Bella had been a U.S. Congresswoman from New York, got on everybody's nerves, no question, but incredibly brilliant. And she spearheaded the knowledge building among the NGOs for how to lobby effectively, which actually is very simple. Write down on a piece of paper the language you want, and then go collar somebody and keep talking to them until they listen. And then when they say, well, what do you want me to say? You have it in your hand. And having it in your hand is the key to lobbying. So I didn't even see the 5-minute, I'm sorry. And in fact, I can stop here because as I said, this chart sort of tells you where all the lobbying went through all of the conferences, starting with the World Conference on Human Rights, running through the Population Conference, running through Beijing. And those conferences put violence against women on the map. And since that time, that's been unquestioned, basically, as a human rights issue. The CEDAW committee, but here's the next issue. The CEDAW committee did not take up honor killing until, and this works into what other people have been talking about, until the Turkish NGOs showed up in 1997 with a statement, and again had the language in their hand and said, this is our issue and you really have to ask the government about it. And they did, and that was the first time it showed up in the record. So it's a really recent phenomenon to be recognizing it. And I think we need to go back, and I'll be happy to talk about this tomorrow, or later today or tomorrow, about what we do with the fact that honor killing became recognized as an ultimate and awful form of violence against women, and is pointed in a number of countries have been nailed on it now. Not all of them Arab countries, by the way, most of them, but not all of them Arab countries, and seemingly selectively, but probably only because of what was in front of the committee at the time and what other issues came up. But do we want to pursue it that way? And can we make it a more sophisticated approach so that instead of saying, go stop honor killing, the committee is given very clear instructions about what to tell governments to do. Make honor, get rid of the defense of honor. Make sure that there is no discretionary sentencing. The very specific kinds of orders that you need to give a government so that they'll do it right, which is what this Turkey conversation is about, is what the UN human rights, not only CEDAW, but all the human rights bodies need to hear. Instead of just saying, they sort of say, whap you out in the face, don't condone honor killing. We need to give them the details about what to tell the governments specifically about how to fix it. And you know what? They'll listen. So, thank you.
Okay, I think we have at least 10 minutes for questions. So, yes. Sorry, I'm going to get I managed to get a question in all day, and thank you so much. That was wonderful. And if you want to come and teach my classes, please feel free.
Just give me a ticket, I'll be there.
Yeah. Just in terms of, because this is what I tell my students as well, is about the politicised nature of this system. And, it's a law course, so they kind of find that hard to get to grips with sometimes.
I know, I teach in the law school, we get the same thing, yeah.
But as fellow lawyers, just to get a bit more into, in terms of actually addressing honour-related violence on a sort of domestic level, and as we know, and you talked a little bit about the fact that this is a state-based system, but human rights law, as opposed to other areas of international law, is more focused on the individual, isn't it? Because it is about the state's obligations to its individual, the individuals within the state,
right,
as opposed to just a state-based system. But how do we actually, in terms of that sort of, it's sort of the vertical, the horizontal, as we talk about as lawyers, sorry to get too technical, but how do we actually address this? Because I looked at this for my thesis, and I didn't put it in the end. I didn't really talk about it in the final product, because I had a big problem with the only way that I could see this happening at the moment is through the due diligence approach, the approach of holding states accountable for a lack of addressing the issues within law. But my problem in the UK context is that if you single out honour violence, and this is me being a broken record again and saying the whole mainstreaming and
right,
sort of, but if you single it out, well, actually, my research showed that the police and the prosecution services are actually paying, maybe not always the right attention, but they're paying a lot of attention to it. And there's all these discussions about criminalising forced marriage and so on and so forth. So can we, A, accuse them of a lack of due diligence? Secondly, what happens if we do go down that approach? What happens to other forms of domestic violence? Wouldn't it not be better to, I just wanted to get your take on it, would it not be better to sort of, rather than singling out honour crimes, think about this within a wider kind of, and there is a discussion starting now about how we can get international human rights law on that domestic level and due diligence level to address domestic violence as a whole.
And this is the piece of the talk that I didn't get. Do you want me to take all the questions first, or do you want me to answer one by one?
Oh, I was looking at one by one.
Okay. So, this is the piece that's okay, because when I have a short answer, it's okay. Usually it's the other way around, I have a long answer. I had a piece about that, which I didn't get to, so I'm glad you asked the question, because the committee has actually, in its most recent I mean, this is where the language is. In its most recent review of Turkey, gave in more detail what the government should do in terms of training the police and the judiciary and setting up the systems to deal with violence and not specifically honor violence. So I think that's where, and again, I think generally speaking, you don't even get that kind of detail, and I think the reason they got this kind of detail is both because the committee is more sophisticated now and because they had very good NGO input, because Turkey has very good NGO input. But this is where we have to go in the entire human rights system, is, it's in the details. We are at the point, the principles are established. We don't have to argue anymore about the principles and get states on board, at least pro forma. But we do need to tell the states very specifically how they need to address their own systems internally, and so that they will deliver on these rights rather than say, well, yeah, everybody has the rights, and then they don't do anything about it. So it's very much about resources, about allocating the money, which is even harder now than it used to be, and about prioritizing that kind of training. And I've been involved in the gender in the courts stuff in the U.S., and it took a long time to get judges on board with a lot of this stuff. And one of the ways, and I will suggest one of the ways to do it, is in fact to mount studies, and that can be done, a lot of it can be done with volunteer help, documenting what goes on with gender in the court system, and just say, look, this is what the problems are. We need to teach the judges to do it differently. And these things that frequently start on the local level. The connection with the local level is to document how things are working in the court system or in administrative bodies, or when you go into a welfare office, go into an office where the state has some control, where some minion has control over a woman's fate. And you document what happens, and then you sort of wave it around. And it's, again, a purely political process. But that it's human rights documentation of another kind. You're not digging up graves, you're documenting problems.
No, I'm glad to hear that, because it sort of worries me when the whole issue of due diligence was really put forward in the inter-American system in the last years.
Yeah, and it's accepted in the it's accepted in the international system as well, and it's something that we dealt with in the commentary. Due diligence is definitely, there is a state responsibility, but the issue really is what we call, and I realized yesterday I wasn't entirely complete about it. It's what we call not only substantive equality, which is, we have the laws, but people have to be able to really enjoy their rights and work with them, which means the state has a responsibility to deliver on the substance of equality. And then there's yet another term, which I don't use very much because it's a little bit problematic. The term that what we're really aiming at for is transformative equality, which is when, every institution is on board. So I'm not even there yet, but somewhere there's a continuum kind of, but you're looking at institutions. You're looking at institutions. I think. Yeah.
So there's one here, one here, and we'll see if we can get through at least both.
In terms of conversations, another few points that you've made in relation to your paper, you state, and I agree, one can't make change until you name the problem in which there's space for politicians to accept and therefore engage in not only procedural aspects of implementing justice, but also this, making sure there are structures in place for the kind of transformative justice that we speak of. I think it's an observation, and there may be a question in there. In 2009, there's a number of us as experts around so-called honour killings. We were invited by the UN, the Division of Advancement of Women, to a massive meeting in Ethiopia. And we all thought that the remit was to ensure that all states apply their due diligence mechanisms to address harmful social practices and so-called harmful
traditional practices.
It's problematic in itself because what
yes.
HTP.
Yes.
And we were told
that dates from 1988, by the way.
There's a whole paper on HTP and so on. But we were told that we did all the work, the report was written, and the UN in New York said to us that we will make sure that every state, the recommendations that you make at the micro level and the macro level will be taken forward, so that all states buy into this. It's now 2011, right? And it wasn't easy because you've been on these boards. People disagree. They want to get back on the plane that they came from because they can't stand some of the people that.
And also they're an addis. I mean.
But the point is that there is a lack of political will. And how many more cases, how many more horrific cases do there have to be of femicide, on global, kind of platform in order for change to occur?
Yep.
So I think what I'm trying to say is how do we move beyond the rhetoric?
Well, this is also why, by the way, the Division for the Advancement of Movement doesn't exist anymore.
I know. But
and
nevertheless, that work was groundbreaking.
And I bet you feel it got lost.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's a common experience. And I'm not going to defend the UN at all around this kind of stuff, because they have expert groups to the right and left of you, and I have good friends who've been on a number of them. And a report is issued, and I will tell you, but here's what I will tell you about that. There was an expert group on violence, it's on here. There's an expert group on violence against women in 1986. The report didn't come out until 1989. And then look how long it took to grind through all these other mechanisms. I think no one effort is going to do it. And by the way, women report. It did come out of the UN. But it only became something when other people ran with it. And I would say if you've done this kind of work with the UN, you take that report and move it every place you can move it yourself.
I did write quite a bit of that report.
Yes, and the fact that it is a UN report is important, but the UN, don't forget, the UN is a club of governments, and they're very, very, very careful about what they order governments to do. And political will is not, we know political will is political, right? It only happens when the people in charge feel the pressure. So it's the same thing about the special rapporteurs, who, the reports of the special experts on violence against women, et cetera, et cetera. Their reports sit on a shelf at the UN until someone does something with them. So it always comes back to civil society.